Okay, we are recording. I'm guessing folks can see us.
Presumably.
Hello.
I mean, is everyone...
Or are we just talking to ourselves?
We're just talking to ourselves.
This is a really professional introduction, isn't it?
Currently 5 participants, which would be us,
Yes.
I think.
Oh, there we go.
6. Someone's in here. Hello.
We have an attendee in the house.
There's
Hello.
2. We got 2.
Get out, run for your life.
Audience.
Exciting time. 3
Oh,
people.
the numbers are going up.
That's a
I can't
bigger
even
crowd than I
catch
was
up.
expecting.
Before it's too late, run. You're obviously in the wrong part of town.
We got
Josh,
even
you're
numbers
meant
of
to be
participants.
encouraging people to come in.
Oh,
Folks,
gotcha.
if you're joining us, apologies for this anarchy. This is what Napoleonic historians are like all of the time. They never improve. They're always appallingly badly behaved. And the anarchy will continue for the next hour. But please do make yourselves at home. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat. Please also bear in mind the session is being recorded, so cameras off unless you are one of the presenters or one of the team behind this event. Otherwise, there'll be nothing we can do. Your face will be in this. Also, please make sure that your microphones are muted. That would be great. Thank you.
I can see some familiar
Hi,
names,
Ross.
which is really nice.
Indeed.
Good morning, good evening.
Who's
Hi,
this
Luke.
Ross Flowers fellow?
Drum
Sounds
roll,
deeply
please.
suspicious.
Hide all the lances.
Oh, the lances.
Very punctual.
Well,
it was touch and go for a moment.
4 of us were punctual. 1 of us wasn't.
Glad that Ross made it.
Yes.
Yes.
We're all very
yes.
relieved about that. Because it was, again, touch and go last night, apparently.
Yeah.
There was much anxiety.
Indiana, Tewkesbury, but not Tewkesbury, UK, which I know.
No.
Tewkesbury, USA.
Is that Massachusetts?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah. I used to live in Tewkesbury, UK, but I was born at the time, so I can't tell you what it was like.
It's flooded.
Hey, Western Australia. Rob.
Hand over.
Hi, Rob.
Tipping us for the furthest away from, well, actually, Jimmy might, no, that's still further away.
Yeah.
It's all a question of perspective, Marcus. Just because it's far away from you doesn't mean that it's necessarily far away from you.
Yeah.
I mean, if somebody patches in from the moon or the International Space Station, I'll be impressed. But apart from that,
San
Ooh,
Francisco.
San Fran. Nice city.
Now that you
hello
just
everyone. We
dissed every
will get
single
underway
one
in
who
just a
said hello.
moment.
It's nice that everyone seems to, obviously, everyone's getting used to the chat function. And yeah, it's nice to hear where people are from.
I think
Maybe we
we should
should.
probably start now, since it's
Yeah. We probably
Jimmy,
should.
Jimmy,
fast.
you asked me to be the host. Let me do the
sit
hosting
down,
duties.
Jimmy. Sit down.
Relax, man.
Jimmy, you
Relax.
can't steal his t-shirt ideas and his hosting duties.
Well, you can try.
Zach
You can
subliminally
try.
stole my t-shirt idea.
Exactly.
we have a connection in our minds, you see, and we don't
Shall
know.
we save that for the libel trial?
Let's
We will
not
give
start the infighting
another
now.
minute. No, we can save that for a minute, Jimmy. We will give it just another minute so that folks who drop in late don't end up missing the anarchy and casual insults that we just love to hurl at each other.
Greetings from Tilsit.
I know who that is.
Ah,
Is that an in-joke? Or is it true?
It is very much
Andy.
a joke because, yeah, I mean, as you all learn, Tilsit is
Harry.
nowhere near South Korea.
I'm
I see.
glad you cleared that one up for us, Jimmy. Thank you
Hey,
so much
Jess.
for that. On
Hello,
that
Jess.
highbrow point about geography, folks, we will make a start, or we'll endeavour to make a start. Welcome to this panel on Napoleonic crossings hosted by Intelligent Speech. What you have before you is a panel of some of my favourite Napoleonic historians who are going to heckle each other, laugh, banter, and vaguely attempt to educate you over the course of the next hour as we debate various aspects of this concept of crossings and boundaries during the Napoleonic era. I am your host, Dr. Zack White, Napoleonic historian and host of the podcast, The Napoleonicist. I am joined by Jacqueline Reiter, who has a PhD in history from the University of Cambridge. She is the author of The Late Lord on the Second Earl of Chatham and is currently writing a biography of the most narcissistic man ever to disgrace Napoleonic history. I am, of course, talking about Sir Hume Popham, who, to Jackie's chagrin, seems to exist in her head to the point where she feels like she's haunted by Popham's ghost. So if any of our audience are adept at exorcisms, please do make yourself known in the chat. Next up, we have Napoleonic commentator Jimmy Chen, who loves to talk about Russian stuff. I really don't think he's going to break the mold today. He runs Napoleonic Impressions, which is very good with penguins and sides of mugs and t-shirt. Yeah, casual advertising. I'm surprised you didn't break out the "Where is Grouchy" shirt. There's a whole discussion going on about that, and I still await my royalties on Salamanca chicken, but that's an argument for another day. We are also joined by Napoleonic commentator Marcus Cribb, who is prolific on Twitter. He used to manage Apsley House. He's currently writing his first book on the Second Battle of Porto / Porto, depending on your persuasion. And last but by no means least, we have Napoleonic historian, vlogger, YouTuber, all-round nice guy, Josh Provan. Josh runs the YouTube channel Adventures in Historyland and has recently written a book entitled Bullocks. That was Bullocks before anybody complains to Ofquell. It's entitled Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira, which is on the Maratha and Jat campaigns. Thank you all for joining me this afternoon. We will simply dive straight in because I know what you're like. You will waffle for an eternity and we therefore need to get on with it. The format is that you will have 5 minutes to pitch your concept for this crossings debate. I will then ask you a willfully acerbic question because that's just what I like to do as a podcast host. So I'm not going to break the mold. Hashtag sorry, not sorry. And then we will move on to the next person, 5 minutes for them, and so on until we finish. And then we will throw it open to the chat for questions from the audience. It will be a microphone off version, so I will read your questions. Please do just post your questions at any point in the chat. I will keep an eye on them and we will endeavour to answer as many as we can once the time is up. Folks, I've heckled you about this before we came on air. You've got 5 minutes and no longer. Otherwise, I will shout and scream and sing songs about how I don't like Napoleon at you. So you have been warned. And we will start with Jacqueline.
Sing songs, huh? I don't think that was quite the turn off we thought it was. Anyway, I'm Jacqueline Writer, and I'm here to talk to you about the crossing that's not just historically important. It stretches the boundaries of credibility so much it's almost fantasy. But except it's not. It actually happened. Crossings, I have those for you in spades. We're crossing oceans. We're crossing lines. We're making the British government very, very cross. That's right, folks. I'm talking about the British assault on Buenos Aires in 1806. And for those of you who aren't in the know, here's a quick recap. In 1805, the British government sent a combined army and navy force to take the Cape of Good Hope from the Dutch. And if you're now wondering why I'm wittering on about South Africa when I said I'd talk about South America, bear with me, the dots will all connect in time. The expedition to the Cape was a complete success, but so swift the naval commander Sir whom Popham got bored of bobbing around waiting for a French counterattack. So he did the obvious thing, and he decided to attack the Rio de la Plata in modern-day Argentina, territory belonging to Spain, which was allied to France at this point, and thus also Britain's enemy. Okay, random. And also stupid, as nobody in the Cape yet knew about the recent naval battle at Trafalgar, which the British obviously won. So they didn't realise the French fleet had been blattered and won and wasn't going to be coming to counterattack anytime soon. On the other hand, the idea didn't come out of nowhere. Popham had been discussing an attack on Spanish South America with various members of the British government for some time. It's just that, you know, they probably didn't want him to do it right now. But there were plenty of strategic reasons for what Popham wanted to do. Most importantly, British trade was suffering because Napoleon had effectively closed off the European continent. An alternative South American market would have been very welcome. South America's mines also yielded an abundant supply of silver, and better that this went into British than French or Spanish pockets, right? And maybe, just maybe, there might be some significant prize money in the offing for the British commanders. Who could say? Silver, very pretty. Anyway, Popham got his way and he sailed in April 1806 with 1,500 men. So that's the ocean crossed, the Atlantic, a physical boundary crossed, it was an invasion obviously, and also a boundary crossed in the figurative sense, because I will remind you Popham had direct orders for none of this, just a blinding sense of self-confidence. We can discuss his motives until the cows come home, but I've only got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to cut a long story short. The little expedition arrived off the Rio de la Plata in June. The army men wanted to attack the military base at Montevideo, but Popham persuaded them the capital, Buenos Aires, would make more of a splash. Not coincidentally, that's also where the silver was. The Spanish governor legged it. The tiny Spanish regular force was defeated, and within days, Buenos Aires was British. Yay! Popham rather smugly sent £1.3 million in Spanish bullion home, where the British government, which had only just discovered that Popham had gone halfway around the world on a gallivant, honestly didn't know quite what to make of the whole affair. But then, oh my audience, then it went horribly, horribly wrong. The city rose up against the British. The tiny force was overwhelmed and forced to surrender almost to a man. The British did capture the fortress of Montevideo, which gave them a foothold until the government sent a much larger force of 10,000 men to retake Buenos Aires in 1807. This was even less successful than its predecessor and was heavily defeated in a massive battle on the streets of Buenos Aires. The military commander, General Whitelock, was court-martialed and cashiered. Popham was also court-martialed, but he was luckier, or maybe he had friends in higher places. He got off with a reprimand. Pretty lightly, you'd say, given none of this would have happened without his bright idea in the first place. So a lot of fun, full of adventure, gumption, and frankly, complete craziness. But it's also much, much more significant than that, because while the British never managed to control the Rio de la Plata, the Spanish never regained control either. The locals had an epiphany. If they could defeat crack British troops, surely they could also defeat the Spanish army. So they got rid of their governor, and within 3 years, they had established an entirely local regime. And then an administrative, I can't say that word, administrative council and an independent government. Spain didn't let its colony go without a war, but to cut the story short again, Argentina declared its independence in 1816 and eventually became accepted as an independent nation, all because the British crossed an ocean. So yeah, I'm sure your Napoleonic crossings were a lot of fun and all that, but how many of them led to the creation of an actual country? That's right, none of them. I rest my case.
Microphone dropped very emphatically, not least because you did it before I even needed to give you a 30-second warning. Other presenters take note, Jimmy, Josh, particularly. I know your reputations, don't start pulling faces at me. Seriously, nicely done, Jackie. Because it needs to be a quick fire session, rather than allow you to sort of wallow in my congratulations and good wishes, I'm going to ask an acerbic question. Does this one also cross the line into insanity?
Well, you could argue that, I suppose. But as I said, there were some strategic reasons for it. It wasn't completely out of the blue. It wasn't that Popham woke up one morning and thought, oh, I could just go to South America. Why not? That's right next to South Africa. Oh, never mind. It wasn't like that. But it really wasn't a very good idea. So insanity maybe, but there are some foundations in sanity.
Just give us a line or two on those strategic kind of considerations and why this might not have been completely mental.
Well, I touched on some of them in the talk. Obviously, there was the fact that taking away the silver from from Spain and France would be useful as opening the market for British goods. There was also the fact that the Cape didn't have much food. It had a bit of a supply problem, and so having a place across the ocean that could supply the Cape would be quite useful. Having two places for British ships to reprovision in the Atlantic Ocean wasn't silly either. They often had to go to Rio, which was neutral. It was a bit touch and go. So there were reasons. There were definitely reasons. It wasn't just a complete rabbit out of a hat.
Brilliant, folks. Remember what I said, we will do questions at the end. Please do post your questions and comments in the chat function, and we will get back to you once all four of our guests have spoken. Jackie, massive thanks once again. That was a brilliant one. That's how to start it, folks. Now, don't let the side down. Jimmy, the floor's yours.
Right. I need to work out how to share my screen, which, there we are, the big share screen button. That should do it. Right. Can you all see my PowerPoint? Yep. Okay, good. So I would like to talk about the River Neman as a window into Napoleon's relationship with Russia. Yeah. Originating at its source near Minsk, the Niemen flows through the Belarus and Lithuania into the Baltic. For centuries, it had served as the border between Prussia and Lithuania. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania in our period, which had been part of Poland, was annexed by the Russian Empire during the partitions of Poland in the 18th century. Meanwhile, in 1806, Prussia's army was destroyed by Napoleon at Jena and Austerlitz. Prussia's Russian ally succumbed to Napoleon at the Battle of Friedland on the 14th of June, 1807, prompting Tsar Alexander I to sue for peace. The two emperors met each other for the first time on a raft in the middle of the Niemen at Tilsit. This symbolic gesture conveyed the message that both men were equals and were meeting on neutral ground between French and Russian areas of control. They seemed to get on pretty well. Alexander looked to Napoleon as a military genius. He greeted Napoleon, "Sire, I despise the English as much as you do." Like President Zelensky, Alexander knew his audience very well indeed. As for Napoleon, he wrote to his Empress Josephine, "If Alexander were a woman, I'd make him my mistress." Make of that what you will. Perhaps owing to Alexander's charms, Napoleon's terms for Russia appeared rather lenient, and the treaty was signed on 7th of July. The only territories Russia lost were in the Balkans, and they don't really matter. Alexander's main obligation was to join Napoleon's continental system, designed to blockade British trade with continental Europe. By not crossing beyond the Niemen, Napoleon secured his eastern flank to focus on his primary objective, waging the war against Britain. In late 1807, he turned his attention to Portugal, an old British ally which remained outside the continental system. Historians continue to debate whether the alliance between Napoleon and Alexander could have lasted. At Tilsit, Napoleon had set up a Polish satellite state, the Duchy of Warsaw, taking advantage of an enthusiastic contingent of Poles who wanted to restore their nationhood with French support, but instead used them to fight his campaigns all over Europe. When Alexander expressed concerns about the duchy being a threat to Russia, Napoleon simply dismissed them out of hand. Perhaps Napoleon's remark about making the Tsar his mistress was not so much declaring a bromance as indicating that Alexander was his subordinate. The dispute prompted Alexander to withdraw from the continental system, which in turn led Napoleon to invade Russia. On the 24th of June, 1812, he and his army of more than 500,000 men crossed the Niemen near Kaunas. The following day, Alexander struck a defiant tone as in the imperial rescript. The defense of the fatherland, the preservation of independence, and the honor of the people forced us to take the field. I will not lay down my arms while a single enemy warrior remains in my realm. While Napoleon got to Moscow by mid-September, after the inconclusive but bloody Battle of Borodino, he only had 100,000 men left, thanks to the Russian scorched earth strategy. Napoleon's men dropped dead from hunger, disease, and heat exhaustion during the summer. By October, Napoleon was begging Alexander for peace. When there was no answer, he decided to retreat. Only then did the combined effect of the Russian winter and Cossack raids lead to the utter destruction of Napoleon's army. When Tsar Alexander crossed the Niemen on the 26th of December 1812, he declared victory in the so-called Patriotic War of 1812. But he didn't stop there. Against the advice of many generals and courtiers, he ordered the army to march on. He realized that Napoleon could not avoid being a source of instability in Europe. Through his initiative, Prussia and Austria joined the war against Napoleon, and British subsidies began to flow in a significant way. By March 1814, Alexander was riding in triumph through the streets of Paris alongside his allies. Alexander ensured that his army behaved impeccably, so much so that the French writer Chateaubriand expressed embarrassment about the extent of the Tsar's magnanimity. But why should anyone care about this? Napoleon was obsessed with Britain, and Britain was obsessed with Napoleon. But the Napoleonic Wars was not only an Anglo-French affair. It was also about France's continental European rivals preventing French hegemony in Europe. But this is not just about setting the historical record straight, or even raising awareness about the Napoleon-Alexander romance. I have discussed briefly how Napoleon tried to deal with Russia, and indeed how Russia tried to deal with Napoleon. As Russia is fighting its brutal war in Ukraine, it is essential to take a greater interest in Russia's role in European history. Done.
I'll be nice to you, Jimmy, and not heckle you for the fact that you ran over by 40 seconds. Oh, wait, whoops, looks like I just did. Hashtag sorry, not sorry. Nice one, thank you for that. Completely take your point that you made about the end there. It is nice sometimes to dwell on a time when Russia was actually doing positive things for the European system, as you highlighted in that talk. I wonder if you could just offer a little bit of clarity for folks, because a lot of us are focused on a single event in the course of this talk. You've taken multiple ones. So in terms of crossings, of the various things that you've talked about, what would you say is the most significant of the various crossings of the Niemen out of the ones that you've outlined?
I mean, I would actually argue it's the last one. It's Alexander's decision to take the fight all the way to Paris, because that's what leads to Napoleon's first abdication.
Short, concise, making up for time that you overran. So I'll give you browning points for that. Well done, Jimmy. Folks, once again, any questions, please chuck them into the chat, and we will get them to our speakers in due course. Otherwise, we're just going to ask questions between each other and heckle each other. But if you feel that makes better comedic watching, then that's for you to decide. Next up, Marcus, are you going to suddenly break the mold and not talk about something connected with the Duke of Wellington?
That's a negative, Ghost Rider. So we're going to talk about a battle which can have crossing in its name. Right from the very beginning, it was an easy choice for me. The Second Battle of Porto, or Oporto as it was at the time, also known as the crossing of the Douro. That is the Douro River that goes from Spain into Portugal and has an outlet into the Atlantic Ocean at the city of Porto, the second city of Portugal itself. Touching on to what Jimmy mentioned about the continental system, Napoleonic imperial forces under France have captured most of Portugal in 1808 to 1809, and basically there's only Lisbon really left and some troops up in the mountains. So I'm going to very quickly give you a narrative of why this matters in this battle. Duke of Wellington has two quick victories at Roliça and Vimeiro, and then has to go back to the UK due to the Treaty of Sintra. When he arrives back in Lisbon in 1809, he has a very quick decision to make. He has to either attack Marshal Ney, the red-headed bravest of the brave, just over the border in Spain, or Marshal Soult, actually slightly further away up in Porto. His main effort, his main thrust, really, he's been given to brief, is to liberate Portugal. It's actually going to be a harder kind of logistically, but as any good military commander should know, they should follow their main effort. So off he goes north towards Porto. He manages to defeat the French vanguard at the Battle of Grigio, and then push onto the suburbs, the Sierra Nova, just outside Porto. And he's standing there at the monastery at the south of the city with the River Douro to his front. About 900 kilometers, 500 miles of wide, fast-flowing water is in front of him, and the other side is a city held by Marshal Soult, a French army that has raped, pillaged, and looted the beautiful and rather peaceful city of Porto before him. He has got to cross that water in order to liberate Portugal, which is why it's so important to today's talk. Marshal Soult thought it was impossible, that he's probably going to get onto boats and go via the Atlantic or go very, very far upriver. This is where a Major Waters, very aptly named, enters the picture. He's an intelligence officer. He's self-taught himself Portuguese, and he goes across the river and comes across a local barber. The only description we've got of him is he's poor and local. This barber kind of insinuates that there's some boats on the far side. Major Water crosses, finds some boats that are meant to have been destroyed or hidden so that the British forces can't use them, gets one boat, gets 5 other men and a local friar, a priest, and they manage to get some more boats and bring them across to Wellington. Wellington sees that he now has enough barges, famous Porto wine barges, for carrying, their kind of main export from the region. And Wellington, quite laconically, very out of style for a micromanager for Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, he stands at the monastery, looks down at the River Douro and says, well, let them cross. The men led by the 3rd Buffs Regiment start to cross the River Douro. If any of the French had spotted them, they could have been blasted out the water by a cannon at very easy range. They crossed. They managed to scramble up the cliffs. If any of you visited Porto, it's actually a surprisingly steep city banks. They scramble up the cliffs, enter a seminary, now a school with thick walls opposite, and repulse at least 2 major attacks made by the French 17th and then the 70th Regiments de Ligne. They reinforced during this time by Hill's Brigade with the 48th and 66th, as well as at least 1 German rifleman who enters the pictures and does a single shot, taking down a French officer. They managed to repulse these major attacks, whilst the rest of the British used the distraction with Portuguese civilians coming out of their homes, discovering boats everywhere they could, literally under the floorboards, and giving them to the British so that the British could march into the city, handkerchiefs waving, women screaming, cheering, kissing the soldiers, and the city is liberated for not too much bloodshed in comparison to many other Napoleonic battles. The city is liberated. About 150 French and Portuguese cannon are found, and hundreds of French prisoners are taken, most of which were in hospital that Marshal Soult had left behind. It liberated Portugal's second city and changed the tide of the war in less than 3 weeks, from Portugal almost falling to being liberated under Arthur Wellesley, soon to be Duke of Wellington, and really did change the course of the whole war, because now a second front could be opened up against the imperial forces now, which will lead to the main thrust of the Peninsular War campaign, which many of you might know. So that's why crossing the Douro matters.
Thank you for that, Marcus. And you kept ish to time. I'll give you 3 seconds. I'll be generous. I'll allow you those 3 seconds because I'm such a generous human being.
So kind.
I know. Gittish question incoming. That's a technical term, folks.
I expect nothing less of you.
Absolutely. My reputation precedes me. How important was Porto in the grand scheme of things? Because we often talk about how this is the second liberation of Portugal. First one, as you explained, taking place in 1808. But it's not the last liberation of Portugal, because in 1810 to 11, let's go with the crossings theme, the French cross the border from Spain into Portugal again with the 3rd invasion of Portugal under Massena with 100,000 men, give or take a bit. So in terms of the wider significance, how important was this crossing, would you say?
It's very important both strategically and politically as a crossing, mostly because it allowed the British government to have the kind of resolve that the war was winnable. Before this, they thought effectively the war was not going to be winnable and that there might be a chance to do something around Lisbon, later the lines of Torres Vedras, but that was about it. So it actually gave the confidence in the rest of the war, likes of which we haven't really seen in other conflicts, where a small expeditionary force gives this wider confidence for the battle. So short answer, very important and a very good crossing too.
I'm liking this. You're all being very efficient in terms of your answers and timekeeping. This never happens when we record podcasts with this lot. It's an absolute nightmare, and we spend about 4 hours online. Josh, please, my friend, I beg you, don't break the mold. Talk about pressure. Take it away. What's your crossing?
My crossing is actually the final crossings of Napoleon Bonaparte. 3 passages that had a great effect on the history of Europe and the wider history of the world, because they helped transition Napoleon from the man that most people were asked to forget about to the legend who would never be forgotten. In March 1815, Napoleon was Emperor of Elba, concealed in his cabin on the brig Inconstant, and as they sailed towards France, they passed a patrolling royalist warship. This crisis passed with a polite exchange of pleasantries, and the breeze brought Napoleon's tiny army to Gulf Juan on the Mediterranean coast of France to begin the 100-day road to Waterloo. Why did he make this crossing? Only a year before, he had been shown ample evidence that he would never be accepted by the coalition powers, and the soil of Europe from Lisbon to Moscow was already soaked in the blood of a generation that had died to either sustain him or remove him. Actually had a valid legal complaint in that the restored Bourbon dynasty had defaulted on the pension clause that the treaty that had sent him to Elba, but he also truly thought, or had deluded himself into thinking, that France wanted him back, that he was repeating his return from Egypt when he had risen to power and glory, and that the will of the French people would be enough to convince the Allies to let him reign. Once again, he thought he would be welcomed as the savior of France and the guardian of her republican ideals. Much of this was illusory, because as much as France may not have wanted the Ancien regime, they were also tired of Napoleon as well. War broke out at once, and the Allies brought their still unified weight to bear on the restored Bonaparte government, broke his main army at Waterloo, and marched on Paris. Meanwhile, the politicians in the city undermined him, and by the summer of 1815, he had abdicated a second time and was fleeing for America. However, instead, he surrendered to the Royal Navy and was transported first to the coast of Britain, and then to the far side of the world in captivity on the island of St. Helena. Here, out of sight of friend and enemy alike, after his second crossing, it was hoped that he would fade from the memory of the world, where he died in 1821. He did so quietly after a long illness, and the event was at such a distance few were able to mark the occasion with any ceremony. And indeed here, many thought it was over. Napoleon was buried in his South Atlantic tomb against the wishes laid out in his will, and though the succeeding turbulence of the next 2 decades of French politics, official celebration of the First Empire was more or less discouraged, although it did happen. Yet Napoleon's legacy continued to develop popularly, and especially in the endless debates about the course France should take going forwards. Then in 1830, after the July Revolution, calls surfaced for the return of his ashes. This was refused. But 10 years later, the unpopularity of the French in Europe for their activities in Egypt and Algeria prompted the Prime Minister Adolphe Thiers to consider the return of the ashes as a grand theatrical gesture that would revive international interest in the king's person and his monarchy. Knowing that unification through patriotism and historical memory is a powerful political tool to distract from otherwise looming problems, King Louis Philippe was persuaded, hoping that by giving honors to the dead emperor, it would bolster the reputation of his new dynasty. When the scheme was raised to return the ashes in debate, it proved mostly popular, and even the British agreed to it, despite thinking it a rather silly and very French idea. So despite statesmen like Alphonse de Lamartine brilliantly panning the idea, the motion to return Napoleon to France passed. Napoleon's final crossing from St. Helena to France, much as that to St. Helena to start with, was not of his own choosing. But this time France actually wanted him back. And the massive funeral that occurred in October of 1840 played its part in crowning the legend that had arisen around him. By being laid amongst the soldiers of France at Les Invalides, and as at one time legitimate monarch, he could have actually been buried in Saint-Denis. Napoleon had gone from the bogeyman of Europe to a sort of idol, a talismanic figure brought back to save France and whatever useful semi-libertarian cause that he could be deployed for. He was laid to rest in dignified splendor for the pilgrims to be able to worship at the shrine. And even if his ashes did not prove to be as miraculous for Louis Philippe's reign as had been hoped, indeed the political significance of it all was roundly disappointing, it achieved what the crossings of 1815 had not, to restore Napoleon to power.
Josh, of all of these, I am most impressed by yours when it comes to timekeeping. Others, I expect to vaguely keep to time because they're ever so slightly scared of my ability to issue withering insults. You are not known for your ability to be concise, and you did it majestically there. Thank you for that, because I didn't want to have to heckle you, because you are one of the nicest people I know. And a great pitch. Thank you very much for that. Let me pose an awkward question. Is the final crossing the most significant? And the reason I say that is that we all know that the return in 1815 led to a series of events which you could regard as inevitable. Certainly, there was an inevitability about the defeat once the Allies unified. So is the final one the most significant, or can we say that the second one, the crossing to St. Helena, is more significant because it's on St. Helena that he goes and writes his memoirs, albeit through other people, and therefore has such an impact on history? What are your thoughts?
I think that the gentleman Lamartine did have a similar point about putting Napoleon in a sort of a hagiographic pantheon. He said he didn't need to be memorialized because he was basically against the idea. He respected him, but he didn't need to be memorialized. And the point was made that the funeral crowned him rather than sort of established the legend. So in a way, I do think that although his return to France might be the obvious choice for the most significant, it could well be the Helena passage, just because that is where his own propaganda machine kicked into gear, basically. But it is a very difficult sort of question because both are equally significant in how we remember him today.
If it was a nice question, I wouldn't have bothered asking. I like to try and trip people up because I'm just a horrible individual. Anyhow, we do have a number of questions in the chat. Thank you for these, folks. Please do keep them coming. And equally, folks within the speakers, if you've got questions you want to fire away, do let me know privately. And if we've got time at the end, we will try and get through them. Andy Meakin asks, Jacqueline, with regards to Popham, it seemed that he tended to do a lot of unusual, that's a nice gentle term for it, Andy, thank you for that, a lot of unusual things. Did he tend to act like a privateer?
Oh, yes. Well, he has been described as a pirate, overtly. I wouldn't apply the term myself, simply because I think there is a bit of a question mark over exactly how much of this he was doing on orders, not direct orders, certainly. But I think that if he had been told to go explicitly, he wouldn't have done it any differently. There is a question mark over how much of the silver he wanted for himself. That is a difficult question to answer. A lot of historians have done a lot of maths about this, and I think the jury is still out on whether he actually fingered the silver himself. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure that everything he did in his life did have some significant aspect of self-promotion and self-enrichment. So I would certainly not be surprised. But I don't think that was his only motive here. I think he did like to do to make grand gestures, do crazy things, and sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. On this occasion, it didn't. I think privateering, as I said, I think privateering is probably not the right word to use. I think it is one of those terms that you certainly could argue, but I think it does very much take a perspective, and you know, you can take perspectives on just about every event of the wars, and argue a point in from one extreme to another. So in other words, I'm going to sit on the fence here. I'm going to say no, I don't think it was a privateer, but I'm not going to say that you can't say he was one.
I think those splinters in your trousers are going to take some removal there, Jacqueline, from sitting on that fence. And staying with you for the moment, Luke Baxter asks, was this crossing the point at which the Falkland Islands became British? Could you just clear that one up for us?
No, I don't think it was. I have to say I'm not entirely au fait on the history of the Falkland Islands. My understanding is that they were currently Spanish at this time. I think they had been British previously. If I was on a quiz show, I'd probably be crashing and burning right now. But the Falkland Islands are not involved. It was quite well geographically focused, in that the British never really got beyond Buenos Aires and Montevideo. There were some interesting plans about maybe going to Chile on the other side of South America. What? There are mountains.
Mere details, Jacqueline, mere details.
Anyway, I mean, the whole plan was just crazy from beginning to end, but I don't believe the Falkland Islands were involved. I can't tell you exactly when they became British, but it wasn't then.
Okay, thank you. Marcus, Andy Meakin asks, having spent some time on the Peninsular War. Was this crossing, as with many French failures during this conflict, a case of the French underestimating Wellington?
Oh, good one, Andy. Yes, in simply put, they often did. I don't know if I can get onto my main thing here of thinking of Wellington, Wellesley as a defensive general.
You've got 15 seconds.
They're certainly underestimating him because they think that he can't cross the river. They think he's going to hold in Sierra Nova and have to go either way. They've underestimated him at Grigio. They've underestimated him here. And they also didn't actually think he was going to get there. Soult had a very long baggage train, and he was quite safe in his mind that he was going to be able to escape. So yes, hugely a case of undermining.
One for Josh here from Christopher Goebel. Josh, did the return of Napoleon's remains to France help his nephew? And if yes, by how much and in what way?
By his nephew, you mean Napoleon III? Well, it could have hurt him, and in the sense that the idea of it was to try and solidify Louis Philippe's monarchy and government and support for the new regime, you might call it, the new dynasty. But because it failed, it did, I think, aid in it did fail as a political stunt to get Europe on board with what France was doing in North Africa. It did, in a way, continue the sort of the downward trend of faith in Louis Philippe, and that was a good thing for Napoleon III in the long run, I think. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Another one for Marcus. Was Wellington keeping the decision to attack at Oporto at arm's length a case of, if the attack failed, he would then be able to shield himself from blame given what happened with the Sintra inquiry?
I think actually almost the opposite. I think if he failed, his reputation would have actually been very heavily damaged. Given Sintra, he was admonished of any wrongdoing. So were the other generals involved in Sintra, without going into it. But Wellesley probably had the least amount of blame there. This was then more of a tactical and strategic problem. If he'd failed at Porto, they wouldn't have been a good footfall. So actually, I'd argue that this was a really high risk Porto. It was one of the highest risk battles going forward, and doing an amphibious crossing is actually almost unheard of. So I'd say it's really high risk, and he could have lost a lot.
One for Jimmy here from Rob Coastland. If Alexander had stopped at the Niemen, do you think Austria and Prussia would have moved on France? That's a great one.
I think it would have been very unlikely. Prussia at the time, even though it had rebuilt its army, King Frederick William III was fairly weak-willed, and at the time he was an ally, albeit a reluctant one, of Napoleon, and he required someone visiting to change sides. And as for Austria, I think, at the time, Metternich still wanted to sort of keep Napoleon on board. Obviously, the Emperor of Austria was Napoleon's father-in-law. So I think without sort of the Russian manpower that came with it, I think it would have been very difficult for them to turn against Napoleon.
Rob Coastland has another one for Jackie. In many Napoleonic podcasts, I've heard how audacity was valued in British naval officers. Is Popham therefore beyond the pale in his actions of 1806, or is he characteristic?
Oh, that's a good one. He definitely wasn't characteristic. I don't, not because he was audacious, but because he didn't really fit in any sense. And I think partly because he was not a very popular figure already by 1806 in the Navy. Because he was a bit of a square peg in a round hole, to use a cliche. He was he crossed lots of other borders as well. He crossed the amphibious border. He was an expert in amphibious operations. He got his post captaincy from the army, not from the Navy. Basically, he rubbed a lot of people up the wrong way for a lot of reasons, not least because he was a giant narcissist, as I think we've mentioned previously. So I think that had some relation to why the reaction against him was so violent. But I mean, obviously, his actions were crazy. So the real question is, why didn't he get punished more than he did? Who knows? Audacity in the Navy. Yeah, I think there were a lot of people who were very much like him. I mean, you often find his name paired with people like Thomas Cochrane or Sidney Smith. I'd say the main difference with Popham is that, unlike Cochrane and Sidney Smith, he didn't have the lineage behind him to back him up. He didn't have the connections. So whereas Cochrane or Sidney Smith could just about get away with things, Popham was really much more on a limb. So that would be my answer.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Folks, I'm afraid after a whistle-stop tour that was certainly far more efficient than I've ever been able to manage when I'm hosting this lot, we do have to bring this to an end. Thank you so much for joining us for this one, this kind of exploration of crossings during the Napoleonic period. I'll leave it to you to come and heckle us on Twitter in terms of who you think won or not. You will find Marcus on Twitter at mcribhistory. Jacqueline is at the late Lord. Jimmy is at JSC1812, and Josh is at Land of History. You'll find me at Z White History. I've been your host, Zack White. Marcus, Jackie, Josh, Jimmy, it's been great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. Until next time, folks, thanks a lot. Peace out.
We all go in different directions now. I think I have to go to a different